I'm very excited and proud to have here with us for our talk, Urgency and Collective Action, Navigating Climate Reform in the Arts, representatives from two of New York's, if not the world's, most prestigious institutions, the Museum of Modern Art and the Guggenheim, and an artist who bravely merges her practice with community activism. And I'm really looking forward to hearing how, in their respective positions, deal with the issue of climate responsibility and consciousness, and how that manifests in their work. I would like to start with Whitney, because you are the Associate Director of Sustainability at the Guggenheim, so you have sustainability in your job description or in your job title. You described yourself in your own words as a mother, a strategist, a sustainability advocate, and an attorney. And that already hints at a sort of very eclectic way in how you got to be in the position at the Guggenheim. And you still are the director, or co-founder and co-director, right, of Sustainability Brooklyn. So maybe you can sketch out briefly your trajectory and into this role.
Sure, thanks. So I'll try to make this brief. When we talk about climate responsibility, that really began from birth, really, where I'm from. I'm from Dayton, Ohio. I'm from the west side of Dayton, climate-impacted community, meaning we were subjected to, white flight and the impacts of social degradation and economic degradation and environmental degradation. I grew up near brownfields and landfills, and it's a predominantly Black community. So having that perspective has really shaped the way I approach sustainability from an equity lens. From Dayton, I went to Newport, Rhode Island for boarding school on my own volition, which was really exposed me to just a juxtaposition of environments and how crucial environments are to the sustainability of people and nature, and how we can interact with nature. So this juxtaposition kind of sparked something in me that led me to sort of a social justice path. And that, took me to law school. And in law school, I understood the importance of the protection of intellectual property and this conversation of appropriation being linked to unsustainability. And so my focus then was directed towards fashion. And in law school, I was open to this idea of sustainability within the fashion industry, not just from the material side and the overconsumption conversation, but how does that impact the communities, like from where I'm from, and communities in the global South, and women and children, and so labor became a focal point for me. Within 5 or so years after law school, I started my own law firm to really address these critical issues that I'd always been really passionate about and focused on. So my law firm was primarily focused on supporting Black and brown marginalized artists and designers and protecting their intellectual property via contract law and other avenues. So Sustainable Brooklyn was just like a natural byproduct. It was sort of a response to the glaring omission of cultures and communities that have been really left out of the sustainability conversation, but for whom sustainability solutions have been sort of placed upon them, and therefore can be largely ineffective. So Sustainable Brooklyn was really a response to this ineffective kind of solutioning and the leaving out of critical voices in this conversation. We started with events, and then we moved into a consulting space. So we were focused on helping brands really evaluate their sustainable impact from an equity lens. Parsons was also something that made sense. So at Parsons, I teach a course called Design of Business, where I help my students understand and unpack these critical problems that are comprised of polycrises, and help them understand that we call them wicked problem, is comprised of systems, and systems can be intervened and changed, and that's really how we create theories of change. So it's a way to address the climate crisis from a proactive perspective, and not just kind of settling into the climate doomism that I think is so readily available for all of us. And obviously it's a real thing. And all of this experience really led me to this inaugural role at the Guggenheim, where I am tasked with really creating the sustainability mandate at the Guggenheim, which means that I create strategy for the sustainability of our buildings, our facilities, our culture, our staff, and our community, and how we really impact the communities that we serve. Museums are at the heart of their definition, really community centers, right? They're for everyone, ideally. So sustainability touches every aspect of the institution. Within this role as well, within this focus on buildings and facilities, for example, we're focusing on drawing down our carbon by 2030 in alignment with the Paris Agreement, but also with our local law 97. If you're not familiar with it, New York City has a local law that really requires buildings that have over 25,000 square feet to draw down their carbon emissions by 80% by 2030. And if they don't, they face huge fines, which I think is great. But also, I have a lot of pressure to not cost the institution a lot of money. So there's that. And then for our staff and culture, sustainability requires not only a knowledge base so that we understand each other and can communicate effectively what sustainability really means, not only to us, but as an institution. And then there's the next step, which is the cultural shift that's required to embed sustainability into every role, so that it's not just, sustainability, Whitney, you do this, but we all collectively have a part to play in the sustainability of the institution. And finally, community engagement. We work with our education department and our public programming to support climate justice education. And one of our signature programs that we're really excited to support is the World Around and the Young Climate Prize, which we held last year and I think the year before, and we'll also be holding that again this year, so hopefully you guys can make it out in April to that. But that's just a little bit about, where I'm coming from and what I do, and hopefully that was 10 minutes.
Well, no, a little less, which is great, because I
great.
have another question, because just to give an idea of the scope also of your work, there are 27 different departments at the Guggenheim?
So there are about 27 departments, and we have a green team, which I was fortunate to come into this role with a green team fully formed and functioning, thanks to a consultant that we had for 3 years. Her name is Alexa Steiner, and her company is called Root Collaborative. And so over the last 3 years before I started, and before I joined the Guggenheim, our green team worked really hard to create departmental initiatives for sustainability. And now we have 25 green team leaders, so we're missing just 2 departments, but I talk to those departments regularly too. So.
Well, I'm curious about 2 things. One is how, when you have 25 departments, how popular are these initiatives, or what is the relationship with the different departments, and how popular or not popular are these initiatives? You know, what is there sort of, what is the work also within the institution that for you, and then also by extension, working with the artists, because I know you've been working on a new artist contract, I think, at the Guggenheim, and maybe you can speak a little bit about that.
Sure. So the work of the Green Team actually was the result of, or the Green Team was formed as a result of a staff survey that we sent out 3 years ago. And the survey indicated that 84% of staff really wanted sustainability to be a focal point for the institution. So from there, it wasn't really a hard sell, right? We had some departments who were already evaluating how much carbon they were using, like our registrars. We had other departments who were really focused on waste management, like our fabrications department. So these initiatives were already, like, the seeds were already planted when the Green Team started, so it was really a natural kind of process for us to just, or the consultant we were working with, to just organize them in a way that helps them work more efficiently, but it wasn't that hard of a sell. And my approach, because the Green Team is a significant part of my work, but it's only a portion of the work that I do. And because I'm coming from an artist-first perspective, I understand that artists have innumerable leverage, right, to create change and to really shift institutional dynamics sometimes more than we can internally. So I worked with our legal department. One of the first initiatives I did was to change our living artist agreements so that they reflect a clause that invites the artist into this conversation, into this work that we're doing to manage our waste and be just more responsible environmentally and socially. And so the first living artist to sign that agreement will be Jenny Holzer, fingers crossed. And from there, we started training our curators to have just more climate knowledge and to broaden their perspective about sustainability, and really for them to be invited into this work that I'm doing as thought partners, because I cannot do their jobs for them. So it's really helpful to have participation at that level at the institution.
Well, thank you. I think this is a great segue into the curator on our panel, Carson Chan, who is the inaugural director of the Emilio Ambasz Institute for the joint study of the built and natural environment. You have, since we spoke about very practical things, you actually are going straight back from here to installing your inaugural show also, which opens on Wednesday at the Museum of Modern Art, Emerging Ecologies. And I would like to maybe start with, can you explain, because the Ambasz Institute was created in 2021, so it's very recent. Can you maybe explain what the mission and the reason for the creation of the Ambasz Institute at MoMA was?
Sure, yeah. Well, thank you for having me.
Oh yeah, we have some slides also.
Yeah, so these will just run as I speak. But yeah, thank you for having me and for putting this really important panel on. So the Ambasz Institute, as you said, was founded 2 years ago, and it's the first of its kind in any major museum. And the interest of the Ambasz Institute, the aim is to focus on the relationship between the built and natural environment, or the fraught relationship between the built and natural environment. So something like 40% of the world's greenhouse gases every year comes from the built environment. And this is something that is not widely recognized, and this is something that a lot of architects don't recognize either. So part of what I aim to do at the Ambasz Institute is to really change the way we talk about architecture, change the way we define architecture when we talk about architecture, academically, in the museum, but also in society at large. So what I mean by that is to, mainly, or in general, architecture is understood as buildings. So architecture as object. What I'm interested in doing is kind of change that into architecture as process. So everything from the resource extraction of how do we make buildings, how do we get the material for buildings, labor conditions for that extraction, the historical, economic, political, racial, social context of a building, to the kind of aftermath of the building. What happens when we're done with the building? Do we demolish it and put everything in a landfill, or do we reuse the material and make new buildings? All of that is architecture, and the building is just one small part of that process. And so this is what I aim to do, and I think by transforming the definition of architecture from object to process, we can start to include conversations that away from just purely building design, which doesn't really address the climate crisis, but we can start to address the crisis through the entire process of buildings. And one thing that I understood very early on is that there's not one thing we can do at the museum that can address all the different audiences of MoMA. And so the idea with the Institute too is that beyond doing the kind of normal museum things like making exhibitions and publications, that we want to have specific programming that would address specific audiences. So right now you see this Doc Talks and MoMA, and this is an initiative in which we do basically work-in-progress sessions with doctoral students from around the world who are studying architecture, the intersection of architecture and environment, giving them a platform, but also kind of supporting their research. We've been together with Pinup, making YouTube videos, focusing on artists and architects and designers who have put environmental and ecological issues at the forefront of their practice. And so living on YouTube, these 10-minute videos are accessible to the widest audience possible. We've been doing a lot of closed, kind of non-public facing projects as well. One of the biggest hurdles to addressing the climate crisis in architecture is the architecture schools. It's not talked about in schools, it's not discussed, and because it's really difficult to make that switch. So we've been doing something called Studio in the Anthropocene, where we invite every architecture school in the US and Canada to join in once a year to discuss the urgency of talking about climate crisis, to develop a kind of climate literacy in architecture schools, and have industry leaders there as well, and talking about how they're actually demanding this from students as they join the workforce. What else to talk about? Well, the exhibition, as you said.
Well, yes, actually,
Okay.
I was just going to get to that because I think one thing I want to point out, and that to me is personally very fascinating, is your PhD is on the aquarium, or the aquarium architecture in the 20th century. And MoMA is often, described as the temple of modernism. And so, architecture in what a modernist architecture is often understood sort of in opposition to the natural environment. And I'm curious, the aquarium is that interesting tension between the, sort of the working with the natural environment, preserving it, or, it has this sort of, this architecture of the aquarium carries that tension within it. And the show, Emerging Ecologies, which opens on Wednesday, looks at specific examples of architecture from the 20th century where exactly the building was not in opposition to, or it was a different process. Like you said, it's architecture as process rather than object. So maybe can you speak about some of the examples of what you'll be showing in this inaugural show?
Yeah, I mean, thinking back to kind of my doctoral research, looking at aquariums, modern aquariums. What's interesting about that research is that a lot of aquarium archives have been flooded, throughout the years. And so in many ways, the kind of, even just this kind of merging of natural systems and modern architecture has not been a kind of easy one. One thing we want to do with the exhibition, Emerging Ecologies, which opens to the public on the 17th, not the 13th, is to establish a kind of counter movement, let's say, or an anti-movement to modern architecture that we're calling environmental architecture. And this is, looking at architecture from the 30s to the 90s, roughly the same period as modern architecture. But unlike modern architecture, which we can say has a kind of, aesthetic kind of, consistency, a recognizability, the work of environmental architecture is diverse. It's polyphonic. Everyone is interested in environmental and ecological kind of issues in their practice, but many people define environment and ecology in different ways. So we have someone like Phyllis Birkby, in the exhibition, who is looking at environment through gender. And then we have, people like Maria Telkis and Eleanor Raymond, who are looking at environment through solar energy only. And so the diversity of the work is, I think, what characterizes environmental architecture. You mentioned MoMA, and MoMA has been, for more than 100 years, or for about 100 years, let's say, a kind of mouthpiece for modern architecture, of the kind of building design as architecture model. And in a way, we can think of this show as kind of undoing a little bit of that history, perhaps building a new one.
Great, thank you. I want to point out that part of the video series that Carson mentioned, Mary Miss, is one of the subjects. And Mary, I don't know where to start with you. There's so much to introduce you. You are an artist, foremost, and a community organizer. You say place is your medium, and you've been practicing since the late 60s. And you're also part of the largely male-dominated land art movement. One of her installations here in New York for all of you to visit is in Battery Park, South Cove, from 1988, just down the West Side Highway. You're planning a new work now for the Nasher Sculpture Institute in Dallas for a forthcoming show, which is called I have to look this up, Groundswell, Women of Land Art. It's a brand new installation. But today I wanted to talk to you about this project that you initiated in 2009, together with Olivia Georgia, I believe, and it's called City as Living Laboratory, short call for short. And maybe you can talk about what made you, as an artist, made you want to start this initiative, this nonprofit, and what you are hoping to achieve with it that you couldn't or can't as an artist.
I think I would start by trying to continue some of the things that Carson was talking about. One of the things I've found very interesting as the preparations have been started for this, getting the Ambasz Institute integrated into the museum. I know MoMA always does programs, a lot of different programs, but I've appreciated the things which I haven't been able to attend, but discussions that you've been hosting. And you talk about the doc talks or getting the universities together. And I think it's a different kind of thing that you're doing. And I really, it's about bringing people together to start to imagine new paths forward. And I really think that, it's a role that you can play, continue to play, moving forward. We just really need those discussions. So I've been doing work in the public realm pretty much from the start of my career. It's been pretty frustrating as an artist trying to get things built. especially if you live in New York City, one of the toughest places to have things happen. So after, quite a few trial and errors, I did the South Cove in Battery Park City, was completed around, 86, 87. I thought, I'll be able to have impact on the public realm moving forward. Rosalind Krauss wrote an article called Sculpture in the Expanded Field. I took that very seriously. I wanted to be in the expanded field. But to find a path through it was especially difficult. So about 2009, actually it was 2008, the best time to come up with an idea for a nonprofit during the financial crisis, I thought, let's try and form a nonprofit, find a different way of functioning, try to put forward the idea that artists could have an essential role in dealing with these issues that we face, that along with the policymakers and the scientists and the educators, artists and the way they are able to touch people and move people could have this, an important role to play. The other thing is that I really have been trying to emphasize this idea that no one artist is going to come up with a great idea that's going to solve things, but that we need a collective approach. We need to be thinking in terms of a constellation of artists. So, instead of just having people at the crossroads of New York City or any city, can you have them working across the city? Of course, I said earlier, working in New York City is almost impossible. So I was in Milwaukee in 2014. I had done a project there in the late 90s about trying to connect the city with their one of their main rivers. And some people came to me and they said, would you help tell our water story? And this was the first sketch that I did, and it's kind of starting this bullseye at the water treatment plant at the edge of Lake Michigan. But nobody had a, big pot of money to do this. It was really rather an idea that was so compelling to me. I thought, well, we'll figure out a path forward. And in trying to imagine this in the top image, you see the stack of the Jones Island water treatment plant at the edge of Lake Michigan that I mentioned. And in order to be able to do a project that really was for the whole city, that impacted the whole city, I came up with the idea of doing an atlas of water for the city. If you look at maps or photographs, you'll see things called out and numbered or lettered. And I thought, what if we could do this at the scale of the city? Now, my interest in being in that kind of really large-scale arena came from talks that I had with climate scientists, especially Cynthia Rosenzweig. And she said, look, Mary, you can't have individual projects. It's not enough. You have to work at scale. So my role in this whole project was coming up with this conceptual framing about how we could create an urban scale network throughout the city of Milwaukee. So one of the things is from an earlier project, I had found that it was really important to announce this project in a major way as far as what you're trying to do. So I thought, okay, the stack is at the Jones Island plant. Can we repurpose it and make it a beacon to let people know if there's a chance of a sewage overflow into Lake Michigan? So the stack and its vapor are lit blue night to night, and if there is a chance of a sewage overflow, it will be lit red and the vapor also, so that people know not to use their bathtubs and big uses of water. The thing that really interested me is that all of the residents of the city could become part of the green infrastructure. It wasn't something that just had to be built. So I had this idea of doing projects in neighborhoods across the city, particularly underserved neighborhoods where there were major water issues, whether it was because of lead laterals or that the neighborhoods had been built in old wetland areas and the basements would flood regularly. So we started to imagine that there could be a way of connecting with all those neighborhoods. It's not an easy thing. You don't just walk into a neighborhood and say, we're here and we want to do a good deed for you. The thing that's been really important is finding ways to introduce ourselves to the neighborhoods, but have the neighborhoods introduce themselves to us. And we do walks regularly with artists, scientists, and community members to talk about different issues in neighborhoods. The artists really have interesting ways of engaging people. This one artist had about a dozen of these different acetate images of planting that could be held up in front of buildings or in front of vacant lots that the people on the walks could pick up and carry. We do workshops in those neighborhoods because the people who live there are the experts in these places and know what the issues are. So we find out what it is that's most important to them. And through those workshops, these people decide what they would like to have as the word or letter representing their neighborhood. So in this case, you can see the G was selected because of these words. There are, when you get to these markers that we have in the neighborhoods, there are Wi-Fi hotspots for one thing, which is something that has been really popular, but also there's a QR code, and you can hear short and see short talks with people from the neighborhoods talking about their place and what it's like and what it means to them. There's also a way that people can leave their own comments about what's necessary. These markers light up at night with the solar wrap that is on them, and if there is a chance of an overflow, they will pulse so that everybody can see, that in this neighborhood, which may not be within view of the stack, that they can help address the water issues in the city. So that gives you just a brief overview of how this work has been done in Milwaukee. We're working on projects here in New York. My bling here is, these are good luck charms for a project called 1,000 Steps, a project for Broadway, trying to imagine Broadway in Manhattan. There's a Broadway in every other borough of the city as being the place where people would begin to see new ways of living in New York in this century.
What do you find, having founded it 14 years ago, and you're also still practicing as an artist, obviously. What do you find you can do through CALL, City as Living Laboratory, that you cannot do as an artist? And what are the challenges of CALL that are more easily done as an artist?
Well, first of all, I feel that I don't think CALL is separate from my role as an artist. This is my practice. My practice has evolved over a period of time. Also, a really important thing I forgot to mention is that when we go to each neighborhood, we ask who is an artist in that neighborhood who you would like to have do a project. And we do a project with every one of the neighborhoods where the markers go so that you have that constellation. So in a way, what I'm doing as my practice is coming up with a conceptual framing and then the neighborhoods and the local artists are continuing with that work. I think that the thing that is really interesting to us at this point is that these ideas that we've been working on, this kind of toolkit that we're putting together of walks, of workshops, of means of engagement, it's becoming of interest to people in other places. What we would like to imagine is that this approach is something that could be adopted in communities, larger or smaller communities, across the country. So we hope that something can get started here. What is easier about being an artist, working on your own? Everything. You know, it's just, I got to do this project at the Nasher that you mentioned, Felix, and it was so nice because we were only talking to a couple dozen people, you know, not the kind of taking on a city as we have to do if we're trying to do something in New York.
Well, what I'm seeing both with all of you, with Whitney, Carson, and also I believe you said that a lot of the government agencies or the city is interested in working with city as a living laboratory. What kind of, I mean, it shows that there is also institutional, not just interest, but support and an urgency to create that. And I'm wondering also, how has the work for Call changed or evolved, given that there's, you know, the interest in the work has become more and more, let's say, institutional?
I don't want you to think that this is a huge group of people implementing this project call. This is totally bootstrap.
Well, everyone should join, really.
Everybody's welcome to join in this effort. We'd love to have you, but you know, we're just a small studio that's taking this on. And I'd say one of the hard things is trying to imagine how to make this transition to letting these ideas go further. So we've had all these years of working on this. How do we not collapse under the weight of trying to take it to this next level? We're working with FEMA in Washington, D.C. on the Anacostia neighborhood. How can that practice be integrated into FEMA, the most impossible agency anybody has ever tried to work with, if any of you have been in disaster zones? So I'd say the connection, or that connecting, taking those ideas forward, making that connection is something that we need help with. That's why I love the kind of things you're doing, where a conversation can be spread further.
I mean, I think one thing about scale too, you know, in terms of the reach of a museum or the reach of a YouTube video, the size of the new audience, you know, is important. But one thing that I've been thinking about a lot at the Ambasz Institute is the temporality of that messaging. And that made me think that, you know, a lot of the work that we're doing now in the museum, I want to translate into things that children can actually absorb. And this is new for me. I've never worked with children before in my curatorial life. But, you know, if we're going to be talking about the climate crisis, in many ways it's the 6-year-olds we should be talking to, not the 60-year-olds, or both, you know, but really focus on the next generation that can be, you know, enacting policy in the future. And so in terms of how that is messaged, well, you know, we transform, you know, a lot of the research, exhibitions that we do into activity sheets for children. And then we've been distributing that throughout New York schools. I think more than 5,000 New York schools have participated in our program. And another is to, think of programming specifically for a younger generation. And how do we kind of, instead of trying to, as you said, shame people or kind of mire people down in kind of negative messaging. How do we just change the context in which people are thinking about this question in the first place? So for example, if we were to say, make a children's book or a children's video about circular economy, but within this whole book, we never use the word waste. So all of a sudden, maybe in a generation or two, you have people growing up without a concept of waste, let's say, and all of a sudden, the idea of using a plastic cup for 5 minutes and then burying it in the ground for 500 years seems all that much more ridiculous. So I think it's about, how can we as, institutions or people working in the arts, how can we effectuate change, not as policymakers, not as lawmakers, like what are our abilities, within what we do? How can we change someone's context and ideas in that?
Something that's been very interesting to think about and work on as we've been doing this, taking on this undertaking, is the role of institutions. And we're looking for a way to sustain watermarks, which is such a process-oriented. We've been working since 2014, and we're just now getting work implemented, in other words, things built. And we're looking at a museum, a public museum in Milwaukee as being the future home. And one of the things we're trying to put forward is that everything doesn't have to happen in the institution, but that the institution can move out into, communities and not just expect always everybody to come to them. And yet, how do institutions get out there and begin to have some permeable process that works both ways? And I think that's one of the most exciting parts of this project, is imagining the roles of institutions going forward.
Yeah, exactly. I really appreciate that perspective, because that's sort of what I'm bringing to the table with this role. Institutions can, I think the disadvantage of institutions that they really do get locked in this siloed thinking and this, this idea that, we are the beacon of reimagining and holding space, so it makes sense for you to come to us. But sustainability work and the response to the climate crisis really does require the breaking down of those walls and venturing out into the communities that we impact. So one of the ways that we're really thinking about this is, just with our green team in general, in terms of finding community partners that we can volunteer with, finding ways that we can bring Guggenheim programming to different boroughs, and just, really, I think living up to what Frank Lloyd Wright really wanted with this building was, this place that doesn't have walls, right? And I think it is really important for us to, or, whatever the walls are called in architectural, we have external walls, but internally we are really circular, and so how can we bring that ethos, that architectural ethos, to the communities that we serve? I really think that's the only way that we will see the merging of and the effectiveness of institutions globally in response to this crisis. And Carson and I are, working together. It's kind of unheard of at this point, but we have formed a coalition of, New York art museums where we are collectively trying to work together to figure out how we can respond to the climate crisis collectively as New York City art institutions. And it's, these meetings have been really eye-opening and inspiring, and I'm looking forward to that conversation, but I know that that is one aspect of kind of getting outside of our ways of being and collectively working with other institutions to respond to the climate crisis.
Maybe just to respond also to what Mary was saying about the role of institutions, I think the climate crisis really compels art institutions to rethink everything that we do, from the way we store, to the way we exhibit, the way we communicate, to what we show, how we show. And over the past year, together with an organization called Art 2030, we've been doing these discussion series called The Circular Museum. And it was supposed to be a kind of internal, for museum staff only kind of discussion, but then now it's open to the public. And it's every time it's a different museum director and artist from a different place in the world talking about their solutions or their strategies for addressing the climate crisis. And in the first episode, we had Francis Morris, the director of Tate Modern, really asking, in a world in which we don't know if things are permanent, does it make sense for us to try to store things as if we need to store it forever? The kind of conditions. Should we collect? What should we show? Does it make sense to build new walls every 3 months and then throw it in the landfill and then build new walls again while trying to educate, ourselves and our public about the climate crisis? Gitte Orsku from the Moderna Museet in Stockholm challenged her artist and her museum to do a whole year of exhibitions without any shipping, and they did it. So I think it's not about it's not about just like changing our goal a little bit or shifting our plastic to paper, but it's really about how can we reimagine the museum from ground up, and maybe that means taking the walls away altogether.
I mean, the urgency is palpable even here as we're sitting here at an art fair that where also it's a temporary. The title of our conversation is collective action, and I want to use this as an opportunity to encourage collective action here in the audience, and with any questions for Carson, Whitney, or Mary. I think we have a mic. Do we have a mic?
Hello, it's on. Thank you very much for the panel. I have a question that's maybe more for Whitney and Carson, and it is, what are some of the climate literacy challenges you have faced, and how are you dealing with them?
Well, that's a great question. So climate literacy, for me, really starts with, it really does start with this idea of do you understand what I mean by equity? Do you understand what I mean by access? And if not, we have to start there before we get to the climate. One way that we are addressing climate literacy, at least and for our curators, was with this climate workshop. That is a series of workshops, but the first one was really focused on defining terms and aligning on those definitions. And it was really eye-opening to kind of see how much our definitions vary based on our perspectives, based on our cultures, based on our upbringings, based on our backgrounds. And so I identified that, especially through my work with Sustainable Brooklyn, as a crucial point to begin the conversation about how we will make change. So, that exercise alone was really impactful. We start all of our green team meetings with aligning on a definition of sustainability because it changes, based on where you live and what you've experienced. And it's also an entry point to understanding where people are coming from, because the only really effective way to address the climate crisis is really to meet people where they are, which is what I really appreciate about your work, Mary. So I think that's, just one example of the ways, or two examples of the ways that we are addressing climate literacy.
Maybe I'll just give one example. Last Earth Day, so we called the whole April Earth Month. We started putting new wall labels for kind of the most famous MoMA objects, and trying to find ways to narrate these objects through an environmental or ecological dimension, let's say, and everything has. So one example is a sculpture, a wall sculpture by Lee Bonteque, and talking about it through, one way that we narrated that object is to talk about the materials that she used were largely found material. She lived on top of a laundromat, and so she collected the waste material from the laundromat and made these sculptures out of it. And so this isn't something that a lot of people know, but this is in many ways anticipates the idea of circular economy or upcycling. And so just by talking about an object in a slightly different way, we start to think about them differently, and that is we're able to produce a new literacy, hopefully.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, at least. Can we have a mic over here?
Hi. Great discussion. I think it's very informative. One of the things that I'm curious to know more about is what's the call to action for community? And this could be directed to any one of you, because I look at the years that I've spent in education. A lot of people don't even travel out their borough. So going to a MoMA or a Guggenheim, what is the aspect of them being able to hear this type of message of them getting involved? I want to be a part of it because there's artists in every borough of New York. I mean, a lot of stuff is founded, enriched on the cultural aspect of that. So I just want to know, how are you getting out to more of the masses that don't know about these initiatives and how they can be involved in the things of that? This is kind of a two-part question, is how other small businesses can be a part of the aspects of helping with their resources to further along the message.
I would like to start the discussion because this is such a big topic, and maybe we'll just touch on it. But one of the problems is that if you're going into communities that are stressed, to even really take the time to begin to relate to climate change is a big deal. There are worries about paying the rent, about feeding the kids, about health. There are so many issues. And that's one of the ways that we think artists can really be a gateway to being able to begin to engage with this. Climate change is so complex, it's so big. But how can you give people a starting point, a way to begin to feel some agency that something could be affected in their communities? So, of course, small businesses would be a great set of partners in those communities, but how would you think about this?
We are not there yet, just 100%. And I respect that question, because that is really the foundation of why I'm here, how I got here, my perspective. But yeah, we're not there yet. And I hope to see, our education programs venture out into these, communities and engage neighborhoods and students, and bring our kind of programming to these places. But I also would love, and I'm actively working on engaging small businesses, because at the heart of our sustainable kind of sustainability commitment is to work with local vendors as much as possible. So that is already in the works. But then again, it's like, well, who are the local vendors, right? And what are the conditions that they're navigating, and that opens the conversation up to the resources and support networks and what that looks like, and how the Guggenheim or institutions like ours and the MoMA can support the maybe lacking of infrastructure for certain small businesses, so that we can all kind of collectively thrive. I think that is something that is a hope of mine, but we're not there yet.
Maybe just briefly, I think for the Ambasz Institute, our strategy has been to collaborate as much as possible. So for every project or publication or video that we do, we try to find a different partner to collaborate with. The idea being that when you collaborate with an existing entity, when you do that project, you gain their audience and they gain your audience, and you expand the reach of that communication much more than if you just did everything yourself. So for example, with the exhibition, Emerging Ecologies, together with our Learning and Engagement Department, we're working with the Lower East Side Girls Club to do programming with them. So they're going to be coming to the museum and producing programming together with us on the exhibition. And all of a sudden, we gain their community and they gain our community. So, yeah.
Do we have time for one more question? Do we have a mic? Where did the mic go? Here.
I think Zoe's getting it. Oh, okay.
Thank you. Hi. My question is, how do you plan in your institutions and in your personal life to address the financial and educational bar to individuals being sustainable?
Great question. Who wants to start?
You said the financial educational bar. And educational bar. Yeah. For individuals to become sustainable. So I guess I have a question for you. When we think about sustainability, the idea that finance as a concept is really a part of that is sort of, it can be a detriment, but it's also, I think, a facade, right? Like that, it's not necessarily the truth. And so what I try to do in my work, not necessarily with the Guggenheim yet, but try to get people to understand that sustainability doesn't require you to have come from a certain socioeconomic background or consume more to consume less. It's really about the day-to-day actions that you can take to sustain yourself. And I think that is the most imperative for people who are financially disadvantaged. And in terms of education, that is the process of educating, right? Like to help people understand that sustainability and finance really don't have to be inextricably linked, and that there are ways to engage with individual sustainability without having that as a part of the conversation is really sort of like radical and imperative work, and that kind of education starts from the ground up. With Sustainable Brooklyn, we had community events, we had town halls, we went to schools, we used different forms of media to get that messaging out, using social media, but also art and music and different ways to kind of change that narrative. But yeah, I'm just going to talk about that from the Sustainable Brooklyn side, not from the institutional side. Maybe Carson can address it from MoMA.
I'm sorry, I just want to throw in there, and this is something that Mary also spoke about, I don't know if today, but in the previous conversations, is the idea of gentrification and how these things impact conversations that you have with communities, and this sort of fear of the catch-all of sustainability being a sort of standing in for something else. And Mary, I don't know if you have any instances where, you mentioned where you work directly with artists within the communities.
Well, I think the whole thing is trying to get people to take the issue of their relationship to the world, to the natural systems and what supports their lives, to take that personally, to understand that through direct experience. Direct experience is the only thing that I think makes it possible. I had this experience that not everybody, but many people have had it in different ways. I lived right next to Ground Zero. I saw the difference between what happened there and the way it was presented through media, television and everything. It was so extremely different. And I'd say it was one of the most important experiences for me to understand, for people to relate to anything, to the climate crisis, to issues around water, to air, to any of these things. They've got to be made into direct personal experiences. And it's getting all those individuals engaged with this that is the only thing that I think we have as a path forward.
Well, Carson, do you want to add anything? Otherwise, I think these are beautiful words to close on. We're out of time. Thank you, Mary, Carson, Whitney. Thank you all for coming.